how can we overcome procrastination? Imagine you're in an amotivated state. You're just not feeling motivated. You're procrastinating. If you were to take that state of being unmotivated, of procrastinating, and actually do something that's harder than being in that amotivated state, you can rebound yourself out of that dopamine trough much more quickly. So what do I mean? You want to put yourself in a state that's worse than or harder than the state that you're in, or do something quote unquote more painful. When I say more painful, I do not mean doing any kind of tissue damaging or psychologically damaging behavior or anything of that sort that's going to render you injured or not well, even in the short term. And the way to do that is to either engage in some tangential activity, meaning an activity not related to your goal that puts your body into a very different state. So here again, I'll default to the obvious one, which is something like cold shower or cold immersion. Imagine that you or somebody else does not like to exercise. You don't want to exercise and you're trying to get your minimum of 5 days per week exercise and you're just not motivated to do it. There are a couple different techniques to doing this. The typical advice would be just exercise for 1 minute. Okay, just get 1 minute of exercise or 5 minutes, and then use the successful completion of that 1 or 5 minutes as a milestone that allows you to then move to the next milestone. You need to put yourself into a more painful, not less painful state. So what do? You push up against that friction and you exercise for a short while. So the key is to figure out something that, for lack of a better way to put it, really sucks, and yet is safe to get out of that amotivated state, that state of procrastination, quickly. And to do so, you need to leverage something that's painful. So if you find yourself in a state of procrastination, oftentimes a brief 5 to 10 minute meditation where you absolutely do not allow yourself to do anything besides close your eyes, focus on your breath, and we have to force ourselves. So it is effortful. In fact, it qualifies as a basically available almost anywhere. You now have an additional tool in your kit that you can use anytime you are feeling amotivated and procrastinating. Dopamine is critical for overcoming procrastination, for ensuring ongoing motivation, and indeed for ensuring confidence. What is very possible is to leverage the dynamics of both dopamine peaks and dopamine troughs in order to not just maintain your baseline level of dopamine, but to also pull yourself out of any kind of procrastination. Your craving for things is not just about craving for those things per se. It's also a desire to relieve the pain of not having those things. And if you can internalize that and start to develop an awareness around it, you will be in an amazing position to leverage all sorts of aspects of the dopamine system for when you have the propensity to procrastinate. You'll be in an amazing position to overcome procrastination and essentially pursue any goals in an ongoing basis. What is dopamine? Dopamine is what's called a neuromodulator, which simply refers to the fact that it's a chemical that modulates or changes the electrical activity of other cells. Dopamine as a neuromodulator has the basic property of either ramping up, increasing, or decreasing the activity of other neurons. And that's done by adjusting things like electrical potentials and things of that sort. Some people have a greater propensity to pursue things like work or goals in athletics or relationships or a combination of those. Other people, unfortunately, have a greater propensity to pursue things like drugs of abuse. You can think about the mesocortical pathway as a circuit that really governs all of the major choices that you're going to make in life about what to do and what not to do toward your goals and away from the things that you want to avoid. Addiction is a progressive narrowing of the things that bring us pleasure. Healthy functioning of the mesocortical pathway, however, allows us to toggle or switch back and forth between different types of pursuits. Whenever we're pursuing something, we are always looking for cues as to whether or not we are on the right path to achieve that thing. And we are also setting a mindset or a context within our brains as to whether or not we are confident or pessimistic as to whether or not we're going to achieve that thing. Your brain is trying to figure out what happened prior to getting or not getting a reward. And it's comparing what you wanted compared to what you got. At the same time, the dopamine system initiates a motivation signal that takes you through that entire round of pursuit. The motivation is dopamine release also, but from a separate set of neurons within this circuit, driving you forward. And the entire time that it's driving you forward, it's paying attention to what's there along the way, even if you don't realize it consciously. subconsciously. It's basically a scoreboard for how you did given what just happened. What we're really talking about here is, regardless of your genetics, regardless of who your parents are, which obviously you couldn't select, being able to leverage your dopamine system in order to be maximally motivated when you want to be, and indeed to avoid procrastination. This was an experiment that was done at Stanford many years ago and involved children. Then they had free time where they could do whatever they wanted. And what the researchers did was observe the children who selected, by their own choice, to draw pictures. So there were some tables out with crayons and markers and paper, etc. And then what they did was they started introducing rewards to these children. They started putting a gold star, or in some cases a silver star, on their pieces of artwork and telling them what a good job they did. They were increasing the amount of dopamine that these children experience. Then what they did with these children, and in the experiments with adults done later on, was they cease giving them the reward. And what they observed was, you guessed it, a drop in the total amount of time that the children elected to do this activity that initially they were doing quite a lot. Any activities that you enjoy to do, whether or not you enjoy it a little or a lot, but especially if you enjoy it a lot, that you guard and protect by making sure that you don't start layering in or attaching reward, or if you do, that you don't do it terribly often. What this means is not to avoid taking things or doing things that amplify your amount of dopamine. But to be very cautious about how often one does that and how many different dopamine stimulating behaviors or compounds one stacks. You may have heard about this in the context of so-called growth mindset. Young people and adults alike can use in order to get better at anything. And the basic contour of growth mindset is to adopt the mindset that if you can't do something, or if you can't do it well, that you can't do it or can't do it well yet. When we are in a performance context, when we expect ourselves to be able to motivate, or when we expect ourselves to be able to perform and we can't, that often sets up a downward spiral of motivation. It can even lead to situations where we are downright depressed. There's also circumstances where people, myself included of course, procrastinate. We know we should do something, but somehow we can't get motivated. When we are procrastinating, or when we just sort of can't seem to get in gear, the key to getting out of that pain trough is one of two things. I already told you earlier, you can just wait. You can wait till your motivation comes back. And a lot of people do wait. In fact, they procrastinate. They start doing other things that are less painful. What they're essentially doing here is a mild type of addiction replacement. In other words, rather than be in the painful state and wait for it to pass, they're doing things that give them some sense of accomplishment. A lot of people will use this as a tactic so that they get very close to the deadline to complete something, and then they go into a sort of pseudo panic, and then use anxiety as a way to leverage their mental and physical resources to complete that thing.